Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is back. So now we would be moving on to our next session. Okay, the speaker for our next session is Miss Erinne. So Miss Erinne is a science communicator with a focus on research advances across Asia. So she graduated with a degree in biology from the Salle University, where she also served as editor-in-chief of the campus publication. So previously, she was also a staff writer for a Singapore-based STEM media company covering fields from molecular medicine to sustainability. So currently, she also produces digital content for FilWordNet, which is a DLSU-led project on monitoring language evolution online and developing local language technologies. So aside from being a science communicator, Ms. Erinne will also soon pursue her postgraduate studies in Germany. She would pursue neuroscience at the University of Göttingen in Germany. And her main research interests are understanding the cellular processes underlying cognition, and also the information flow in the brain and how experiences regulate the rewiring of neuronal circuits. So it's an honor for us to have Ms. Erinne here. Thank you so much, Ms. Erinne, for taking the time to join us. And I will now hand over the floor to you.
I can't screen share. Oh, there. Can you see?
Yes, we do see your screen.
All right. Audio is okay also?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So thanks everyone for inviting me to this talk to present about my experiences in science communication. I'll just be going over like the basics of SciComm. But before we get into that, I actually want to start off with a quick story. So you might be all familiar with dengue, right? And it's caused by a virus and it's transmitted by the bite of a mosquito. So there's a group of researchers that's actively trying to control the spread of dengue through a method called the Wolbachia method. And what they do is they introduce a bacterial species called Wolbachia into the mosquitoes, and that actively blocks or prevents the virus from being spread because the bacteria kind of like outcompetes the virus. So they've been testing this for years in the lab, and they've shown that it works. But now their next step is actually to test this in the community in a large-scale trial to see if the method will really work on a larger scale, and if it's something that can really prevent the spread of dengue. But then, because this method uses the mosquitoes themselves, right? They don't harm the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes are basically kind of neutralized and immunized against the virus. The method requires releasing Wolbachia carrying mosquitoes into the community. And so what they had to do was they had to talk to people within the community and get their approval first. And this is a great example of how SciComm can sort of bridge research to the community that scientists want to help, right? Because if you imagine, if you're in a community where there's a lot of dengue cases, like for example, in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, if researchers come and say, we want to try and control the spread of dengue, but we're actually going to release mosquitoes. Like you're gonna be like, what do you mean release mosquitoes? Aren't those the carriers, right? So they had to explain, what this method is. They had to explain the potential benefits, but also explain, the potential risks involved. And I think that this is a great example of how SciComm, when it can gain the public's trust, is actually a very useful tool to help translate research into impactful interventions. And so when they got the Yogyakarta community's consent, they actually managed to implement this experiment, and they showed that it worked, and it helped in reducing incidence by around 77% from their first trial. All right. So this story is actually told by Ed Yong. He's a science writer at the Atlantic, and he's probably my favorite science writer. He does amazing COVID coverage, and also talks a lot about other things like sensory experiences of animals and all that stuff. So there's a QR code, or you can also search for it. I highly recommend reading this. So yeah, like I said, that was just an example of how useful SciComm can be and why we need it. I think that SciComm is a way for us to potentially dispel misinformation. It's a way for us to reach out to communities more. And in general, we can classify the goals of SciComm into 4 broad categories. So these goals overlap a lot. Like, it's not just, you produce something and it's only for the goal of appreciation. No. So these will overlap a lot, but I wanted to categorize them because this framework can help us develop our communication materials better and sort of have a direction in mind as to how you would approach communicating your research. So those 4 goals are appreciation, education, engagement, and action. So we're going to go into them very briefly. For appreciation, I have this example here. My favorite example is to just profiling scientists and telling people about their stories, about their work. I think this is a really effective way to sort of humanize the scientists and make them feel closer to people, in the sense that you can show their motivations for pursuing their research, their challenges that they encountered, and then their successes. And it's really just kind of superficial in the sense that you just want people to be aware that this science or this research is happening, but it's an effective way to sort of hook them to capture that interest and then hopefully lead to greater awareness for science and greater understanding of science. Because, well, not everyone's going to get into science, right? But if you can sort of raise awareness about science and about the research that's being done, whether globally or locally, that's already a good first step to helping the larger community understand the value of science. Then the next one is education. So I put here a TikTok, someone who uses TikTok and Twitter. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's pretty famous, I think, locally in the Philippines. He does a lot of, I would say, more health-related videos, and he was an active part of trying to combat misinformation about vaccines, especially during the pandemic. So education is really just about sharing the knowledge in an easily digestible way. And I think that it also overlaps with other goals. So once you understand more about a certain scientific concept, then you appreciate it better also. Or once you gain information about, let's say, the risks and benefits of vaccines, right? You would then translate that into decisions or certain actions. So that actually goes into the next goal, which is action. SciComm can be really useful for guiding decision-making or guiding policy-making. For example, ideally, if you have data on the COVID surges, right, the government would implement policies like lockdowns or mask mandates and so on. Or let's say disaster risk management things, like when you have forecasts or when you are more aware about the hazards that could arrive, you would ideally implement preventive strategies or mitigation strategies to try and prevent, a lot of damage should those typhoons or earthquakes hit, right? So action is really trying to change or trying to initiate certain decisions, trying to change people's mindsets based on the science or what the evidence says. And even on a personal level, right? This could be, for example, learning about cancer risks and going to screening if that's available to the people. And then lastly, engagement. So we've been talking about understanding the science, but I think it's also important to have people be more involved in science. And that means, looking at the community, they're not just passive like recipients of whatever research you're doing. You want them to actually, if possible, be co-creators in the process. And so one example is this picture is of Dr. Rochelle Lucas, and she's from LaSalle's English department, and she worked with computer scientists to develop a dictionary app for an ethnic language that's actually endangered. And so they actively worked with this Hanunu Mangyan community to understand really the nuances of their language, how they want to preserve it, what's important to keep in that dictionary, like pronunciation, the definitions, and so on. So I think that's a good example of how SciComm isn't just all transmitting information, but you want to be more part of a larger conversation and really engaging with or conversing with the communities that you want to serve, right? So our next part is just sort of basic tips for a successful SciComm. Because SciComm is so broad, right? You could be writing, you could be an artist, you could be doing videos. I just compiled what I think are somewhat universal tips. And actually, Sir Jonas's presentation earlier already touched on great points about knowing your audience and knowing your goals. So I'll just reiterate some of those important ones as well. Okay, so the first tip is to connect with your audience and your stakeholders. So it's really important to understand why it's relevant to them, right? You don't want to be, you can do research that's for your curiosity, that's completely fine. But when you're communicating it, I think it's important to know why it's relevant, or it's important to highlight why it's relevant for the community. So you answer the question, so what? Like, what are their needs? Why does it matter to them, right? You could talk about impact. Let's say it's research about biomedicine and it's trying to figure out the cause of a certain disease, something like that, right? So highlighting those impact-oriented applications can be a way to capture your audience interest, or let's say to get funding or to sway a decision or policy in your favor, right? The other thing is that connecting with your audience can also just mean introducing something that's familiar to them. So this example here is actually about a sustainability technology, and the intro is referencing a game, which is SimCity, where you build or develop a city, within that virtual platform. And after introducing this game, so it's something familiar, it's something very not really sciencey, right? It's very something that you can easily get into. And then in this article, it was then related to the technology, which is kind of like a modeling or a virtual platform where researchers and city planners visualize and model how they want to build like a city or a certain urban area, and see, what's the wind direction like, what's the sunlight like, and really see these environmental parameters so that they could build a more sustainable and environmentally friendly area. So you can also scan the QR code in a bit there. So this is for A-Star, which is kind of like the DOST in Singapore. So even here, right, it's not necessarily going right into the impact, like, oh, this is important for sustainability. You can actually introduce it through more popular or more familiar things like games, pop culture, things like that. I think those are really creative ways of relating science to things that your audience might be more familiar with. Okay. The next tip is to choose appropriate media forms. And you'll see that one of the questions there is, what are your skills? So I think that as much as it's important to think of what's a media form that can reach your audience, it's also important to think of what resources do you have now, right? Are you a good writer? Do you want to try out doing video? Do you want to try out doing broadcast, right? at the end of the day, if you're starting to get into psychom, you want to start with something that's kind of familiar to you, that you're kind of comfortable with, right? So I'm a writer, and I would probably never go into science art, right? Although I can appreciate it, but I personally would not be producing that kind of psychom, right? And the other thing is, what's the data that you have to present? So there's a lot of data-oriented stories right now that are, let's say, interactive, or you present certain graphs, and you have to make sure that you present it in a way that's like not only visually appealing, but is actually the correct way to represent that data, right? You don't want to be using the wrong graph to present that, because it can give, the wrong impression or misrepresent your message. So my example here is, I found this recently. It's a WWF project on climate change and sustainability, and they have this interactive online platform that shows different ecosystems, and it's kind of like a virtual museum where you can see how climate change affects different environments. So it's very much geared to, I think, kids and students, and very interactive, a great way to really visualize environment and the damage that climate change and human activities can cause, right? And then my third tip is to create a compelling and honest story. So we've been talking about highlighting impact, right? Highlighting the relevance, but I think it's also important to acknowledge limitations. Admittedly, this can sometimes go against, like, for example, if you're doing science PR, press releases, or more publicity stuff, of course, you want to highlight all the impactful things, right? All the possible applications. But I personally think that it's important to still stay true to the science. Like, if there are limitations, if there are things that we don't know, I think it's important to highlight those if you have the space for it, or depending on like the media form. I think that is critical to building trust with your audience or your community, because if you just talked about the benefits, right? Let's say the Wolbachia example from earlier, if they only talked about the benefits and then something went wrong during the experiment, then I think that would really break people's trust in researchers and in science as a whole. So my example for this one is a podcast where this is from Story Collider, and Story Collider features stories about scientists and the challenges that they go through. So it's not all glamour. It's a very humane look at scientists and what challenges they go through, what values they have, how they approach their science. I think it's really important to highlight these things. And then the lower example is, you might have heard of the supposed research that found the cause of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. And unfortunately, the press release painted it as like researchers have found the cause. And then in a few hours or a few days, scientists were posting explainer Twitter threads saying, it's not really that they found the cause. It's more like a biomarker. It's like a small step, not a really incremental one, right? So I think it's important to choose your words carefully, right? You don't want to say, "Oh, this is the cause," or they've found a cure, things like that. I think that can overhype it, even though we want people to be interested in science. We want people to invest in science. But when you overhype it like that, I think it sets you up for further failure if it doesn't live up to that, right? So it's important to still be aware and to still recognize certain limitations, or to only express it in a way that's true still to what was discovered. Okay, so we're moving on to my journey in STEM and psychom. But actually, during the intro, I think you had a glimpse already of my background. So I'm just going to go through it really quickly. I was a writer first before I got into science. And I think if I wasn't a writer, I wouldn't be in science. So I was a campus journalist, and then I studied bio. And then I did science writing for about a year. Right now, I'm sort of helping out with the research project from my alma mater and doing SciComm for them. And then I'll be doing grad school. What I've learned from all of this is that SciComm can be very fulfilling, but it's really tiring. There's definitely more interest in it now, especially with the pandemic. But I don't want to paint this as like, oh, thank you for the pandemic. No, I wish we didn't have the pandemic and SciComm would still thrive, right? Yeah, so there's more interest in it now. But I think that it's still untapped, especially in the Philippines, just because science itself and science research and development in the Philippines still needs a lot of investment and still has a lot of room for growth, right? And SciComm can't thrive if you don't have the science to communicate about. And so from my experience, I rarely got to report on the Philippines, even though I was covering Asia, right? A lot of it was about Singapore, Japan, Korea. Every now and then, if I'd see a Philippine study or technology, I try to feature it. But yeah, it's definitely like if you only have limited space, you tend to go for the quote unquote more impactful or more headline attention grabbing stuff, right? So SciComm locally, I think, is still growing, and it will depend on how our research team grows. That being said, we do see more articles now from mainstream media. There are a couple of science writers or climate reporters like Miss Gisette Enanyo. She used to write for Inquirer. She's now a freelance journalist, but she still covers climate. And then we're seeing more podcasts, videos, especially about COVID. And then DOST also has sort of strengthened their science communication efforts. I believe they have a science communication program for their funded projects. And yeah, they're using more pop culture references and using more visuals to spotlight the local research that's being done. So these are good steps in the right direction, and hopefully we'll see more of that. But local media hasn't really developed like a science-specific section yet. I don't think I've seen any from mainstream media. Hopefully they do that in the future, sort of like New York Times or The Atlantic. But yeah, these are steps in the right direction. But for other local examples, there's more volunteer-driven ones, like Pinoy Scientists. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but this is on Instagram and Facebook, and the Filipino scientists from all over the world take over and post about the research, post about their experiences abroad, post about even their stances on certain social issues. There's Pinay Skin STEM, which focuses on women and girls in STEM. And then Flip Science is probably, I would say, one of the more famous local science communication initiatives. So they have a podcast, and they're also posting kind of like news bits about different local research. And then student orgs like the UP Association of Bio Majors, they're also starting SciComm initiatives like this newsletter here. So there's definitely interest now, but like I said, it's still relatively young and yet relatively growing, okay? But even though the local scene is kind of still young, I would super encourage students or graduates to try and get into SciComm with whatever platform you're most comfortable with. I think that the communication skills that I've built through writing have helped me as a scientist as well. And it would help you in just about every career path. Whether you go into research, industry, med, I think that learning to popularize science and research and really engage with the people that you want to serve is a very, very important skill set. Right? So there are many different ways, right? It's not just writing. You could have, outreach activities. Being a tour guide at Mind Museum, I think, is one of the best outreach activities that you can do locally. So yeah. So to sort of close my presentation, we've been talking about how SciComm can be important, and I want to leave you with a positive perception about it. But I think that it's also important to talk about some of the challenges. So we know that SciComm, ultimately, we want to make science more accessible. We want to fight misinformation, disinformation. We want to use research to guide decision making, and or maybe we want to get funding support for our research projects. But the reality is that there are a lot of gaps. First and foremost, there's, I still think, a lack of support. Like I said earlier, without investment in science locally, SciComm will not thrive locally. And there's not really a lot of training materials here locally, or training courses. The next one is that there's still the digital gap, right? A lot of the materials, I think, are still online, and that may be inaccessible to a lot of the community or the local community. Or just the notion that, for example, there's the My Museum, which is a science museum, but how many people, would go there over doing other activities, or let's say if you're from a lower socioeconomic class, right, that might not be something that you can afford to go to, or that you would prioritize over, say, doing a part-time job or things like that. So these are very real challenges. The other one is the linguistic barriers. So for example, you could be a really effective communicator, but if you go to a community and they don't speak the same language, you're not going to be able to explain the science. You're not going to be able to understand their needs, right? And the last one is echo chamber. So I just put that as kind of like the entire misinformation, disinformation problem. I think the reality is that it's really hard to cut through the noise, because people will come in with different belief systems, and we really have to understand that before we can try to explain science, right? You don't want to be imposing. You don't want to seem elitist or seem like you know everything, right? So it's really important to understand their beliefs and understand their needs, understand their concerns before we try and talk about science and talk about research and interventions, right? But in spite of those challenges, I still have high hopes, of course, for science communication. I think that it's still an important part of the scientific ecosystem. And when we are able to get to a point where we can show science not just for its impacts, but also its process, right? When we can talk openly about the challenges involved, the failures involved, right? You're not going to get the answers right away. When we can show that process, I think it would help people appreciate science more, and it would help people understand, oh, sometimes, the evidence can change. And then in response, our decisions or our behaviors and our policies will also have to change. And when we notice that process, when we recognize that process, I think SciComm can really be an effective part of not just being like middlemen between science and the public, but really being an active part of social development and change. So that's what I hope SciComm can become. I don't know if we can do it in this lifetime or it's something to work toward, but that's a vision I have for SciComm, especially locally. So that ends my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. And if you have questions in the future, my contact information is there. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Ms. Erinne. So we have time for 1 to 2 questions. So as with the previous lecture, you can either unmute yourself and ask Ms. Erinne directly, or you could also type your questions in the chat box. And we already have one question. So Jason asks, what is your say on using local language rather than English, which is the default language in scientific discourse for Filipino non-scientific communities?
I would say that that's better. I honestly, my Filipino is very poor. So I wish that I could do that, and I definitely think that it's something that could be useful or more engaging and more. It would have better chances of success, I think. Really, the question is the platform and like our local media or our local organizations willing to support that. So definitely local language, I think, is better because that's what the Filipinos are more familiar with. And it's just a matter of trying to translate that and seeing what's the effective way of using the language, even though science is mostly in English. But I still think that local language will be more helpful.
Okay, thank you so much for the great question, Jason. Does anyone else have a question?
I have one question if no one else will. Students don't have any questions. I'd like to ask, first I'd like to thank you, Miss Erin, for such a great presentation. It's very helpful. I would like to ask, when or how do you know if you're the right person to tell a story? Because sometimes you're not an expert in that field or something. So how do you know? How do you tell that story?
Yeah. Oh, that's actually, I struggled with that a lot as a writer because, for example, I'm from bio, right? And then I'm trying to cover, let's say, tech or physics. And I'm like, I don't understand this. How can I tell this story? I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a right or wrong person. I think it's more of being down to like doing your research. If you don't understand something, you have to own up to it and then ask the researchers and make sure that you understand it when you ask them. Most of the researchers I've talked to have been very accommodating whenever I had more questions. I think it's important to not like just write because you think you understand something and then it turns out wrong. So definitely doing your research and asking a lot of questions. And if you have the right intentions anyway, you probably won't go wrong. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So does anyone have any more questions? Okay, so we have another question from Jason. What is the proper approach in understanding the beliefs of other people?
I think this one is more about listening a lot. Yeah. I think because our knowledge systems can be different, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we should invalidate like other people, right? So I think listening a lot, trying to understand how they think, how they feel, what their bases are for making decisions, right? Some people will like to focus on data. Some people will like to are inevitably swayed by emotion, and that's fine. I think it's understanding what factors are important to them, what their circumstances are, and trying to go from there. So definitely listening and trying to keep an open mind. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Jason. We have another question from Ate Florence. Are there any platforms or cheat sheets where students might be able to find common or simpler words to exchange with technical terms or wording in communicating their research? And vice versa, like if they're writing a research paper or poster and they might want to use alternative words.
I'm not sure if there's a cheat sheet, but there is. I want to say if you search for psychomaterials, you'll probably find something, but try the Open Notebook. This is more of science writing, but I'm not sure if they have a specific cheat sheet, but they have more tools or tips about science writing. The other thing is that you can try and read or view existing materials. So if you have access to the Atlantic or maybe some local reports or videos on YouTube and see how they try to explain it, start out with something you're familiar with. Like, let's say, look for a video. Let's say you're doing biochem. So look for a video that does that's psychom. And then that way you can sort of compare, okay, this is how they explain this really difficult term, and try and just look for examples. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ate Florence. For the last question, I also have a question. You did present about DOST and other volunteer-driven efforts to promote science communication. So I was wondering if there's any specific programs here in the Philippines, especially to encourage, let's say, students in schools or the schools themselves to integrate science communication into their curriculums.
Okay, so far, I think locally, there's DOST UPLB has a psychom bachelor course program, something like that. I'm not sure, but yeah, I know they have a psychom department, but I don't think there's a specific training like open to the public kind of training. DOST PCIEERD right now is doing a psychom fellowship program, but it's only been open to researchers who have DOST projects. I do wish there was some kind of training material, maybe like a master's course. I know when I was still studying in LaSalle, one of the faculty, but she's not there anymore, was trying to develop a psychom like subject. But yeah, I don't know if that ever pushed through. So yeah, there's not a lot locally. My museum, I think, is a way to try it out if you're more open to speaking with kids. It's a good practical experience. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Miss Erin. Unfortunately, we don't have all the time in the world. So before we end the session, we would just like to formally thank you for taking the time to join us and to speak about science communication. I think it's important for our audience to really know its importance, especially in this day and age where there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation. So we really thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.